The words didn't come wrapped in anger. They came casually, almost bored. You love being the victim. My daughter said it like she was stating a fact, not an accusation, not even an insult. Just something obvious she'd finally decided to say out loud. We were standing in the kitchen, mid-afternoon light, nothing dramatic, a normal day that wasn't supposed to turn into anything memorable. Someone else was there too, quiet, pretending to focus on their phone, not looking at me, not stepping in. I remember the exact second after she said it, not because of what I felt, but because of what I didn't. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel the urge to defend myself. I didn't even feel surprised. What I felt was disoriented, like the floor shifted just enough to make me question my balance. My mouth opened, closed again. There were a dozen things I could have said. Facts, context, years, exhaustion with receipts. I could have explained how much of my life had been built around not becoming a burden, how silence had been my survival skill long before it became my personality. But none of that came out. Instead, I noticed the hum of the refrigerator, the way her arms were crossed, defensive, already prepared for a fight she assumed was coming. The way the room felt strangely still, like everyone was waiting for me to perform the role they'd assigned me, the emotional one, the difficult one, the woman who always makes things heavy. I realized something in that pause. They weren't listening anymore. They were watching to see if I would cry, watching to see if I would argue, watching to see if I would prove her right. And in that moment, something inside me hesitated, not because I was weak, but because I was suddenly aware of how predictable my pain had become to other people. I swallowed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't correct her. I didn't say, "You have no idea what I've carried." I just stood there. And in that silence, I felt a shift I couldn't yet explain. Not relief, not clarity, just a quiet sense that the rules of this relationship had already been rewritten without my consent. No one rushed to soften her words. No one asked if I was okay. They accepted her version of me immediately. That's when I understood. This wasn't about that sentence. It was about how long they'd been practicing believing it. I didn't say anything, and that's where everything changed. I didn't become a single mother in a dramatic way. There was no scene, no clear villain, just a slow realization that I was already doing everything alone, and had been for a while. I remember the first morning it really hit me, not emotionally, practically. I was standing in the bathroom, brushing my teeth with one hand, tying my daughter's shoelaces with the other, mentally calculating time the way I always did. Minutes mattered. If I missed one bus, the whole day tilted. That became my rhythm. I learned how to make decisions quietly. Which bills could wait, which groceries could stretch, which parts of myself I could postpone dealing with because there simply wasn't room for them yet. I didn't call it sacrifice, I just called it being responsible. I showed up every day, even when I was tired in a way sleep didn't fix, even when my body felt older than it was, even when my patience ran thin and I had to rebuild it before she woke up. I made sure she never noticed the math behind our lives. She knew stability. She knew routines. She knew that dinner appeared, clothes were clean, permission slips were signed. She didn't see me sitting at the table late at night, staring at numbers, deciding which version of tomorrow I could afford. And I didn't want her to see that. I wanted her to feel safe, to feel like things were handled, so I handled them. There were moments, small, unremarkable ones, that meant more to me than I ever admitted. Sitting next to her on the couch while she talked about school, listening to stories that went nowhere, watching her grow confident in a world that felt less forgiving to me by the year. I told myself that was enough, but appreciation never really entered the room. Not from her, not from anyone else either. What entered instead was expectation. It became normal that I would adjust, that I would accommodate, that I would absorb discomfort so no one else had to feel it. If something was hard, I figured it out. If something went wrong, I fixed it, quietly so it wouldn't ripple outward. I didn't complain because I didn't want to sound ungrateful. I didn't ask for help because I didn't want to owe anyone explanations. And somewhere along the way, that silence turned into an identity others were comfortable with. The strong one, the capable one, the one who didn't need checking on. I didn't realize how dangerous that was, how easily steadiness gets mistaken for absence of need, especially inside a family, especially with a child who grew up watching me absorb everything without comment. By the time I noticed the imbalance, it already felt permanent, like correcting it would require a confrontation I didn't know how to have without breaking something fragile between us. So I kept going, doing, providing, adjusting, and telling myself that being seen wasn't as important as keeping the peace. What I didn't see then, what no one warned me about, was that silence doesn't just protect. Sometimes it teaches people how to misunderstand you completely, and the version of me they learned wasn't the one I thought I was showing. It didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a single argument where everyone suddenly turned on me. It was quieter than that, more reasonable on the surface, the kind of shift that feels harmless until you realize you're standing alone. I noticed it first in conversations that changed when I walked into the room. Laughter would soften, topics would shift. Someone would say my name like they'd almost forgotten I was there. I told myself I was imagining it, that people were allowed to talk without me, that not everything was about me. That explanation worked for a while. Then came the comments, not directly to me, never directly. She's just under a lot of stress. She takes things very personally. You know how she is. They said it with concern in their voices, as if they were being generous by understanding me instead of questioning me. The strange part was how easily those explanations traveled, how quickly they became accepted truths. I could feel opinions forming about me in rooms I wasn't invited into anymore. I was still showing up, still doing what I always did, but it was like my role had changed without anyone telling me. I wasn't the steady one anymore. I was the problem that needed managing. I remember sitting at a family gathering, watching people exchange looks over my head. Not hostile, worse, pitying, like I was fragile glass, something to be careful around. Someone mentioned a decision that affected me, a plan that had already been made. I asked a question, just one. The room went quiet. Not because I was loud, but because I wasn't supposed to ask. "Don't start," someone said gently. "We just don't want this to turn into a whole thing." A whole thing. I nodded, smiled even, let it drop. Inside, something went cold. It was then that I realized how much of the story had already been written without my input. I was the emotional one, the difficult one, the one who made everything heavier than it needed to be. And the most unsettling part, no one ever checked if any of it was true. They didn't ask me what I was feeling. They didn't ask why I might be tired or overwhelmed or quieter than usual. They just adjusted around me, as if I were an inconvenience they'd learned to accommodate. I started hearing things back through others, versions of myself I barely recognized. She always thinks she's being wronged. She thrives on conflict. I listened to those words and felt numb. Not angry, not defensive, just oddly detached, like they were talking about someone else, someone I didn't quite remember becoming. And still, I didn't confront anyone. I kept thinking there would be a natural correction, that eventually someone would notice the gap between who I actually was and who they believed me to be. I kept waiting for fairness to assert itself. Instead, the distance grew, and with it, a quiet understanding settled in. Once people agree on a version of you, truth becomes optional. I didn't know it yet, but the isolation wasn't an accident. It was preparation for something worse. By the time I realized what was happening, the language had already shifted. No one said I was wrong anymore. They said I was too much. It was subtle, careful, the kind of criticism that wears concern like a disguise. You're taking this the wrong way. We can't even talk around you. You always assume the worst. Always. Even when I was quiet. Especially when I was quiet. I learned quickly that silence didn't protect me. It was being translated. Every pause became evidence. Every neutral expression was read as resentment. If I spoke calmly, I was being passive-aggressive. If I didn't speak at all, I was being dramatic. There was no correct response left. What hurt wasn't the words themselves, it was how confidently they were delivered, as if my inner life had been studied and diagnosed without my participation. They talked about my emotions like facts. She's sensitive. She holds on to things. She never lets anything go. I wanted to ask, what things? When? But I already knew how that would sound. Defensive. Difficult. Proving their point. So I stayed quiet. And that quiet became useful to them. It allowed decisions to be made without resistance. It allowed my absence to be framed as maturity when it was convenient, and as emotional instability when it wasn't. If I looked tired, it was because I dwelt too much. If I looked fine, it was proof I'd been exaggerating before. I started questioning myself. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I had made things heavier than they needed to be. Maybe all those years of holding things together had warped my perspective. That was the most dangerous part, not their judgment, but how easily it slipped into my own thoughts. I'd replay conversations late at night, wondering which tone had given me away, which word had marked me as the problem. I practiced being lighter, smaller, easier. I edited myself in advance. What I didn't realize then was how comfortable everyone had become with that version of me, the agreeable one, the one who absorbed discomfort so the room could stay calm. When I finally did try to express something, softly, carefully, it was met with a sigh. See, this is what we mean. That sentence closed something in me, because I understood then that the goal wasn't resolution, it was compliance. They didn't want to hear how I felt. They wanted me to stop feeling it in ways that affected them. And still, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't walk away. I didn't demand to be understood. I stayed. I listened. I let them believe they were being patient with me. But underneath that patience was an expectation. Quiet, heavy, and unspoken. They were waiting for me to break. They just didn't realize I was already changing. Once they decided who I was, the consequences started to solidify. It stopped being about tone or feelings. It became practical, permanent. Money came up first, not dramatically, casually, like it always did. Decisions were made in rooms I wasn't in. Numbers discussed as if they were neutral, as if they didn't represent years of my life. When I asked for clarification, I was told it was already handled. For your own good, someone said. You don't need the stress. I noticed how easily that sentence traveled, how often it was used to justify excluding me. Then it spread to other things. Appointments scheduled without asking, plans made that assumed my availability, conversations that treated my time like it belonged to everyone else. Even my health became a topic, spoken about with concern, not consent. She's been fragile lately. We don't want to overwhelm her. Fragile? I'd carried households on my back. I'd managed crises without witnesses, but now, suddenly, I was too delicate to be included in my own life. What made it worse was how reasonable it all sounded. No one was yelling, no one was cruel on the surface. They smiled, they reassured me, they spoke slowly like I might shatter if they didn't. And somehow, I was expected to be grateful. The pressure wasn't loud, it was constant. If I pushed back even slightly, I was told I was proving their point, that I was escalating things, making them uncomfortable, turning a simple issue into something emotional. So I learned to stay still, to nod, to agree, to say it's fine, even when it wasn't. They waited for me to crack. I could feel it, the subtle anticipation in conversations, the careful watching, the way silence stretched after certain comments, like a test. Would I cry? Would I argue? Would I finally lose control? I didn't. Instead, I began to notice things differently. How quickly they dismissed my input, how often they used my past against me, how my calm was interpreted as guilt instead of restraint. The more I didn't react, the more cornered I became, socially, emotionally, logistically. There were moments I was alone, truly alone, when the weight of it pressed hard enough to make me dizzy, when I wondered if this was how people disappeared from their own lives without anyone noticing. But even then, I didn't reach out. Not because I was proud, because I understood something they didn't. They were mistaking endurance for permission, and every time they expected me to break, something in me hardened instead, quietly, deliberately. I didn't know exactly what would come next. I only knew I wasn't going to collapse the way they were waiting for, and that unsettled them more than any outburst ever could. The shift didn't announce itself. There was no moment where I sat up straight and decided to change my life. No late-night revelation. No tears that turned into resolve. It was quieter than that. So quiet, I almost missed it. I noticed it in how tired I was of explaining things to myself. I would replay conversations out of habit, the way I always had, searching for the mistake, the tone I should have softened, the sentence I should have swallowed. But one night, halfway through that familiar spiral, something stopped. Not anger, not clarity, just a flat certainty. I wasn't confused anymore. For the first time, I didn't ask myself whether they were right about me. I didn't debate their version versus mine. I simply saw the pattern for what it was: consistent, rehearsed, comfortable for everyone except me. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The decision I made wasn't dramatic. It wouldn't have looked like anything from the outside. I stopped volunteering information. That was it. No announcement, no boundaries spelled out. I just paused. When someone asked a question that didn't feel safe, I answered briefly. When conversations veered into explanations I'd once rushed to provide, I let the silence stretch instead. At first, it felt wrong, like I was withholding something essential, like I was being dishonest by not filling the space. But the more I held back, the clearer things became. People revealed themselves quickly when I stopped doing the emotional labor for them. They filled the silence with assumptions, with stories, with confidence that had nothing to do with facts. And for the first time, I wasn't trying to correct any of it. I started keeping records quietly, not out of revenge, out of self-respect. Dates, messages, decisions that had been made for me. Things I'd once brushed aside because acknowledging them felt like inviting conflict. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't change my tone. I didn't withdraw completely either.
I just stopped trying to be understood by people who had already decided not to understand me. There was no relief yet. If anything, the tension increased. I could feel it in how conversations shifted, how questions became more pointed, how my calm suddenly made people uneasy. They sensed the difference before they could name it. I wasn't reacting the way I used to, and that made them nervous. Because silence, when it's no longer asking for permission, starts to sound like something else entirely: preparation. I didn't know exactly when it would surface or how. I only knew this: whatever was coming next wouldn't require me to raise my voice. It would speak for itself.
The truth didn't arrive with drama. It came the way real things do: quietly, officially, and too solid to argue with. I was sitting at a table, hands folded, listening while someone else read from a document that had my name on it. Not as a suggestion, not as an opinion, as a fact. Dates, numbers, records. Things that didn't care how anyone felt about me. I didn't look up right away. I already knew. Across from me, I could feel the shift before I saw it. Chairs creaked. Someone cleared their throat. The confidence that had filled the room earlier, that easy certainty about who I was, began to thin. "This doesn't match what we were told," the voice said, neutral, professional. Not accusing, just stating. I finally lifted my eyes. My daughter was there. Not defiant this time, not folded into certainty. She was very still, watching, processing. Someone spoke too quickly, tried to explain, to smooth it over. "That's not how we understood it. There must be context missing." The person reading didn't react. "This is the context," they said, tapping the page lightly. "It's all here." I felt something loosen in my chest. Not relief, not victory. Just the absence of pressure I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten it was optional. No one looked at me directly. They looked at the papers, at each other, anywhere but at the version of me they'd been so sure about. What struck me most wasn't the realization on their faces. It was the recalculation. I could see it happening in real time, the mental scrambling, the quiet panic of trying to reconcile who they thought I was with what was now undeniable, the discomfort of knowing they'd been wrong without being able to blame me for it. I didn't say a word. There was nothing to add. My daughter finally spoke, her voice lower than I'd ever heard it. "You never told me." I turned to her then, not defensive, not angry. "I wasn't asked," I said. That was all. No edge, no accusation, just truth placed gently between us. The room went quiet again, but this time it was different, heavier. Not waiting for me to react, waiting for them to absorb what had already landed. No one apologized, not yet. They sat with it, with the discomfort, with the knowledge that my silence hadn't been confusion or weakness. It had been restraint. For the first time, I wasn't being assessed. I was being reconsidered. And as we stood to leave, as papers were gathered and chairs pushed back, I realized something that surprised even me. This wasn't the moment I'd been waiting for. The real reckoning hadn't even started yet. After that day, things didn't magically soften. They changed shape instead. Conversations became careful, not warmer, just measured. People chose their words like they were walking across something recently cracked. No one rushed to repair what had broken. They just acknowledged, quietly, that it couldn't be ignored anymore. I noticed the distance first. Not dramatic distance, no cutoffs, no declarations, just a subtle stepping back, fewer assumptions, fewer decisions made on my behalf, a new hesitation before speaking about me instead of to me. I didn't fill that space. I let it exist. My daughter tried once, not with an apology, not exactly. She asked a question that circled the truth without landing on it. I answered honestly but briefly. I didn't give her a version designed to ease her guilt. I gave her the version that was real. She nodded, took it in. We're still figuring out what we are now. I didn't rush that either. Forgiveness wasn't something I owed anyone, and reconciliation wasn't a performance I was willing to give just to make things comfortable again. What I felt instead was something quieter, acceptance without surrender. I had stopped needing to be believed. That changed everything.
The strange thing is, once I stopped explaining myself, people began to listen more carefully, not because I demanded it, but because silence, when it's no longer pleading, carries weight. I kept my boundaries understated, firm but unannounced. I let consequences speak instead of emotions, and for the first time in a long while, my life felt like it belonged to me again. Not because I won, but because I no longer participated in a story that required my erasure. Some relationships didn't survive that shift. Others did, altered, imperfect, more honest than before. And I was okay with that. If you've ever been labeled for staying quiet, if you've ever been misunderstood because you didn't defend yourself, if someone mistook your